Okay, we are going to talk about reading and writing fractions and decimals. So let's go. Okay, so in your regular place value chart, you're probably used to seeing ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, even 10,000s, 100,000s, millions, 10 million, 100 million, and so on. And those represent our whole numbers. But where do fractions fit on our place value chart since fractions are still numbers? Well, in between the ones place and the fractions, there is something called a decimal point. That decimal point separates your whole numbers from your fractions. Just like in money, you might have $1.27. That decimal point is in between, separating your whole dollars from your part of a dollar. So after the decimal point, we have a place value called tenths with a THS and hundredths with a THS. And these are our fractions that keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And this actually keeps going. You have thousandths and then 10,000ths, 100,000ths, millionths, and so on for infinity, which makes your fractions just incredibly small. So again, that decimal point will separate your whole numbers from your fractions. So what does this look like? Well, here's a model of one whole separated into 10 equal parts. If I was to write that as a fraction, I would write 3 out of 10 or 3/10. But how do I write that as a decimal? Well, in my place value chart, I'm going to just show my ones place decimal point separating from the fractions. And in the ones place, I would put 0 because I don't have one whole of anything. I only have a fraction. That decimal point will separate that 0 from the amount of tenths. And so I put a 3 in the tenths place. Now, the way that I say this, a lot of people might say 0.3, which is kind of a casual way to say it. But the language of a mathematician, we want to say it correctly, and we would say 0 and 3/10. So that decimal place is where we say the word and. So again, 3/10 or 0 and 3/10. Let's take a look at another one. Here's another model of one whole broken into 10 equal parts, and this time 9 of them are shaded. So as a fraction, I would simply write 9 out of 10 or 9/10. Again, as a decimal, I would say, well, in the ones place, I have nothing. I have 0 because there is not one whole of anything shaded in. My decimal point separates my whole number 0 from my fraction of 9/10. And so I just write a 9 in the tenths place, and I get 0 and 9/10. So let's try another one. This is a one whole broken in 10 equal parts again. This time, 7/10 are shaded. Again, I would have nothing in the ones place, 7 in the tenths place, and I would say 0 and 7/10. Now, what happens if I take one whole and I cut it into 100 equal parts? Well, we know that the more you break up or partition or cut something, the smaller your parts will get. So with 100 equal parts, I have pretty tiny little squares. As a fraction, let's see how many are shaded here. I can probably count those columns as 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, and then one more makes 41 out of 100 or 41 hundredths. Now, how would I write that as a decimal? Well, this time I need to have my hundredths place in my chart. So again, in my ones place, I have nothing because there are no one whole models shaded. In the tenths place, if I look at this model very carefully, I actually do have 4/10. If I had not broken up that model into 100 parts and just left it as 10 parts, I would have 4 columns shaded. And if you look at the top model and the bottom model, those 4 columns really are exactly the same thing. So in the tenths place, I would put a 4. And in the hundredths place, I have one little hundredth left. So I have a 0 in the ones place, my decimal point separating my whole numbers from my fractions, a 4 in the tenths place, and a 1 in the hundredth place. Now that looks pretty complicated, but it's actually really easy to say. I say it a lot like I would say the fraction. So I would say 0 and 41 hundredths. I do not say 0 and 4/10 100ths because that just sounds kind of kooky. I just put that 41 together. It's representing 41 hundredths, so I just say it, 0 and 41 hundredths. So let's take a look at another one, another model broken into 100 parts. This time it looks like I have 10, 28 parts shaded. So as a fraction, I have 28 hundredths. With my place value chart again, I have no whole numbers. In my tenths, if I look at a tenths model, I do have 2/10. So I would put a 2 there, and then I would have 8 little hundredths left over. So I'd have a 2 in the tenths place, at 8 in the hundredths place, but I would just read it as 0 and 28 hundredths. Remember, this is not 0.28. This is not 0 and 2 tenths 8 hundredths. You just read the whole thing, 0 and 28 hundredths. So let's try this one. If I look at this model, I can tell, just by looking at it, I can tell this is 1/2. But if I was writing it in my denominator of 100, I would say this is 50 out of 100, or 50 hundredths. And for my place value, I have 5 tenths and no extra hundredths. Well, let's really look at that carefully. I have no whole numbers. I do have 5 tenths. Let's look at a model. If I have that same size model broken into 10 parts, and I have 5 of them shaded, I do have 5 tenths. But if you look directly underneath, that 50 hundredths is the exact same amount. So I could say either one. I could say that this model is 5 tenths. I could say it is 50 hundredths. I can write it as 0 and 50 hundredths because I do have no 0 extra hundredths. So 0 and 50 hundredths, but I could also say 0 and 5 tenths because those amounts are exactly the same thing. So 0 and 50 hundredths or 0 and 5 tenths, they are equal. You can write them either way. So now this is one that actually often really tricks kids. I have a model with 100 parts and only 5 are shaded. So as a fraction, that's pretty easy. I write 5 out of 100 or 5 hundredths. But the decimal part is where it gets a little tricky. So again, I have nothing in my ones place. I have a decimal point separating my whole numbers from my fractions. But if I look at my tenths, I don't have any. I don't even have 1/10. It's a pretty small amount that I have. So I need to write that 5 in the hundredths place because I only have 5 hundredths. So let's really look at that. If I put a 1/10 above this model, that is more than my 5 little hundredths. So I actually don't have any tenths. So I have to represent that there are 0 tenths and then 5 hundredths. And again, I would read this as 0 and 5 hundredths. You have to be very, very careful. If you put a 5 in the tenths place, you're saying 0 and 5 tenths, and that is not true. So when you have this tiny little amount, make sure you are putting your digit in the hundredths place. And then looking and see, do you have any tenths? If you don't have any, you need to represent it with a 0. So now you can go try it. If you get confused, you can watch this video, watch other videos that show decimals and fractions, and give it a try.